Welcome. In the previous video, we saw how America cracked from within after independence. But now we will tell you how those internal tensions opened the door to two global wars that set the world ablaze. Today, I will take you not only to the battlefields, but also behind closed doors in Washington, to the whispers of bankers, to submarines sailing beneath the seas, and to a single attack that threw millions to their feet one morning. Why did America initially want to remain neutral? Then why did it send millions of troops across the ocean? And the main question, were these decisions truly necessities, or an inevitable fate? At the end of the video, I will ask you, if America had chosen a different path that day, would the world we know today exist? Now, let's go to the first major turning point. America in the shadow of World War I. When Europe was ablaze in 1914, America was far away, both geographically and mentally. President Woodrow Wilson had declared his country would remain neutral. Most Americans believed that Europe's imperial struggles did not concern them. Newspapers were full of war news, but the public still held the belief that the Atlantic will protect us. But behind the scenes, a completely different picture was emerging. American banks were lending billions of dollars to England and France, factories were producing ammunition, and merchant ships were constantly crossing the Atlantic. Officially neutral, but economically increasingly drawn into the war. America. Then German submarines appeared on the scene. U-boats began sinking merchant ships heading to British ports. When the passenger ship Lusitania was torpedoed in 1915, hundreds of Americans were on board. The newspaper headlines ran a single sentence: "American blood spilled in the sea." Wilson was still trying diplomacy until 1917, when the German Zimmermann telegram surfaced. The message Germany secretly sent to Mexico: "If you attack America, we will give you land." It was no longer just about trade. It began to be seen as a matter of American security. And the question echoed in the halls of Congress: if we don't go in today, will it be too late tomorrow? America was slowly, unwillingly, but irrevocably coming to the brink of war. The invisible war in the Atlantic. America had not yet officially entered the war, but the Atlantic Ocean had already become a secret front. German submarines were moving beneath the dark waters, cutting off trade routes to England. Even if American flagged ships were not targeted, every explosion sent this message to Washington: you could be next. But as the war dragged on, Germany began to take risks. At the beginning of 1917, the following decision was made in Berlin: unlimited submarine warfare will be launched. That is, every ship that came its way would be sunk, regardless of its flag. This was a red line for America. One after another, American merchant ships were damaged. Insurance companies were in danger of collapsing. Porters, sailors, and industrialists began to exert pressure. "President, this cannot continue." And there was another truth behind the scenes. If Britain collapsed, the billions of dollars in loans America had given would also collapse. This was no longer just a matter of honor. This was a matter of economic survival. The invisible war across the Atlantic was slowly changing the minds of the American people. Neutrality no longer seemed safe. The breaking point in Washington. In the spring of 1917, the corridors of Washington were more tense than ever. Newspapers reported the sinking of a new ship every morning. Editorial columns were filled with anger. Senators were receiving threatening letters from their constituencies. Wilson had trouble sleeping at night because he had two options: to enter the war or to accept German pressure and retreat. Both were terrifying. Entering the war meant sending millions of young men to the front. but not entering. It meant America would no longer be taken seriously. The Zimmermann telegram exploded in this very atmosphere. Newspapers published the document. The headlines were shocking. Germany is inciting Mexico against America. This was no longer just a war in Europe. This was perceived as a direct threat to America. Members of Congress were shouting from the podium. Some were still advocating for peace, but more and more people began to use this phrase, "If we stop today, tomorrow war will be at our doorstep." He had the speech prepared. Those sentences that would go down in history. He was chosen to accustom the American people to the idea of war. The world must be made safe for democracy. The countdown had begun. The final days leading to the declaration of war, April 1917. Washington was in the spring, but the air in the capital was dark. Beside the right path where Congress was going, there were cameras, journalists, and military advisors. He gave his speech, calm, measured, but resolute. He said America could no longer stand idly by. He spoke of ships sunk at sea, threatening telegrams, free trade, and national honor. The hall was silent. Then applause. Then the vote. And the decision to enter the history books. The United States declared war on Germany. There were mixed feelings in the streets. Some were waving flags. Some were thinking of their sons' needs. Some were wondering how long this would last. No one lived through it. This decision would change America forever. The Atlantic was no longer just an ocean. It was the distance between America and the fate of the world, and America gave the instruction to decide to complete that distance. A giant awakens, but without a uniform. When America entered the war, the world held its breath. But behind the scenes, there was a far more disturbing truth. Europe had been at the front for 4 years. France was bleeding, England was exhausted, Germany had become a war machine, and America, on paper, it was powerful. Its industry was enormous, its economy was vibrant, its population was large, but the number of soldiers, it was insufficient. Officers were writing reports, generals were looking at maps, Congress was debating the budget. There was no time. Wilson signed new laws. Compulsory military service came into effect. Young men lined up in front of the registration offices. Some were volunteers, some were hesitant, some were afraid, and some believed it would be short-lived. But no one knew exactly what the trenches in Europe were like. Camps were established. Muddy areas were turned into training grounds. There was a shortage of weapons. There weren't enough uniforms. There were units sharing rifles. And yet the newspapers ran headlines like, "America is coming." But the truth is, America was just learning to walk, and facing it was a continent running. Hope across the Atlantic. Recruiting soldiers wasn't enough. They needed to be transported to Europe, and in between, there were German submarines. A convoy system was established. The ships would not move individually, but in groups. Destroyers circled around them, watching for the slightest ripple in the water. Every voyage was a gamble. For every ship leaving the port, the question was, will it return? The soldiers stood silently on the deck. Some were writing letters. Some were looking at the photograph in their pocket. Some were watching the sea. No one spoke loudly, because the sound of a torpedo wouldn't give a warning. Meanwhile, Washington was waging another war, a propaganda war. Posters were printed, films were made, speeches were given. America was being told, this is not just for Europe, this is for our future. But not everyone was convinced. Some were still asking, why us? If America didn't act quickly, the losing side could be determined before the war ended. And America didn't want to be a last-minute giant. The first American footsteps. Towards the end of 1917, American troops landed in France, bands played in the harbor, flags waved, morale was high. But as they approached the front, those images faded. Trenches, mud, barbed wire, burnt villages, the sound of cannons. Allied officers in Europe watched the Americans carefully. They were young, most had never seen war, but they were disciplined. And their numbers were increasing. New ships arrived every week. General Pershing wanted this. The Americans would fight as their own units. They would not disperse into other armies. This decision would be very important in the future, but no one yet fully understood why. The first clashes began. Small raids, reconnaissance operations, trench guard duty. The Americans were learning the rhythm of war, but the enemy they faced had been in this hell for 4 years, and this difference would lead to great consequences in the future. The road of no return. America was no longer just sending soldiers. Artillery shells, tank parts, food, trucks, aircraft engines. A river of industry was flowing into Europe. Factories were working day and night. Women entered the production lines. Cities began to change. The economy was shifting to wartime mode. But something else was happening inside. Opposition. Anti-war voices were rising. Newspapers were shut down. Speeches were monitored. The government had begun to see those who opposed the call for unity as dangerous. So, America was transforming not only externally, but also internally. And no one knew how far this would go. Because war, once it begins, it doesn't just stay on the battlefield. The noise before the silence. American troops had been approaching the front line for weeks. They were unloaded from trains and carried to the trenches on night marches. No one spoke loudly. Orders were whispered. Maps were opened by flashlight. The battle formation that Europe had known for 4 years was still foreign to the Americans. The ground had been dug up. The trees were gone. The villages were nothing more than fragments of walls. Commanders thought long and hard before dividing the troops. They didn't want to send inexperienced soldiers directly into large-scale assaults. First, small raids would be conducted, the enemy's firing patterns would be deciphered, and artillery coordination would be learned. But the front rarely accepted this. The other side didn't expect it either. German observers had already noticed the new uniforms. For the first time, the Americans heard the sound of heavy artillery so close. The tremor shook not only their ears, but also their chests. The planks of the trenches rattled, and earth fell on their faces. Some gritted their teeth, some prayed. Others, realizing they felt nothing, were afraid of this. That night, the first reconnaissance units were sent forward. They would infiltrate the barbed wire fences, surveying the enemy's positions. There were lines on the maps, but the real world didn't match them. The trenches were filled in, the fortifications had collapsed, the roads had disappeared, and everyone sensed the same thing. This was only the beginning. America's real test had yet to begin. First blood, first shock. The first conflicts started small. But small things rarely remain small on the front lines. As an American patrol advanced through the fog, machine gun fire erupted. The sound was so close that some reflexively ducked to the ground. Mud splattered. One soldier screamed. Another dragged him away. No one stopped to look. Stopping meant death. Artillery support was called in, but coordination was not perfect. Systems that had been working in Europe for years were not yet fully integrated with the newly arrived troops. Map reading errors, delayed messages, misplaced shells. The chaos of war was not as ordered as described in training camps. When the first casualties were brought to the rear, faces changed. Young men who had been joking just a few days ago were now silently looking at the ground. Death was not a statistic, but the empty space next to it. Commanders reviewed the reports. The German defenses were strong, the barbed wire was deep, the trench lines were layered. Breaking through this front would not be possible with courage alone. Meanwhile, newspapers were still running hopeful headlines. Those studying in America couldn't sense the reality in France. The mud, the gunpowder, the blood, the two worlds were drifting apart. And the soldiers on the front were beginning to understand this war wouldn't be short, and it wouldn't be easy at all. Learning by fire. As time passed, American troops began to grasp the rhythm of the battlefield. This meant not only executing orders faster, but also learning to read the language of the earth, the sound of the night, the color of the sky. Guard schedules were reorganized, hours were divided into shorter intervals, and wooden supports were driven into the trenches to prevent them from collapsing. The mud, heavy with rain, sucked like a vacuum under their boots. Every step seemed to whisper that the earth wanted to hold the soldier. Scissors were tried to silently cut through barbed wire, and metal surfaces were covered with mud so they wouldn't shine at night. Masks no longer hung in bags but around their necks because of the possibility of gas attacks. The painful pressure of the rubber straps was a constant reminder of the approaching danger. But the hardest thing was waiting. For hours, for days, just listening. The faint hum of the wind on the barbed wire, the distant sound of cannons whose direction was difficult to discern, the deep movement vibrating beneath the earth, almost pulsating. And then suddenly, everything exploded. Artillery fire tore through the sky, shattering the darkness of the night with orange lights. The walls of the trenches crumbled, earth rained down on the soldiers' shoulders. Orders were shouted, voices lost in the explosions. Messenger soldiers ran knee-deep in mud. Troops advanced a few meters, then retreated, then regrouped and charged again. Distances shown as thin lines on maps were in reality turning into hours-long, breathtaking battles. The Americans watched the Allied officers carefully. The calmness of the British, their measured advance even amidst the explosions. The stubbornness of the French, their determination not to leave a single piece of trench, all were etched in memory. These armies had been forged in war for years. The American soldiers, however, were being dragged into this fire day by day towards the same toughness. The faces of the first arrivals showed astonishment. After a few weeks, that expression disappeared, replaced by heavier, more cautious looks. The young faces hardened. The jokes were getting shorter. Letters were being written more slowly. Envelopes from home were now opened more slowly. Lines were read several times, then carefully folded and placed deep in pockets, because everyone knew there might not be another opportunity to read that letter after the next attack. Sleep was fragmented at night. Eyes instantly opened when an explosion was heard in the distance. Hands went to rifles, and no one truly felt relieved. And everyone could sense that the next big attack was approaching. This feeling didn't come as an order. It slowly settled in, like a weight hanging in the air. Maps were reopened, spread out on tables, shadows flickering in candlelight falling on the lines. Arrows were drawn, directions were determined, artillery plans were reviewed repeatedly. Officers spoke in hushed tones, fingers pausing at certain points then pointing to another possibility. But no one said aloud, how many of these arrows would be erased? How many would be redrawn a few hours later? How many would remain only on paper? Because everyone knew these lines would soon be more than just ink. And this new lesson learned on the battlefield would be written not from books, but by passing through the fire. The approaching storm. Observation reports piled up on the tables, red-penciled markings increasing daily. The congestion on the railway lines, the accelerated shipments behind the front lines, the expansion of ammunition depots, all were noted down, then discussed again. No one dared to make a definitive judgment, for a wrong prediction could determine the fate of thousands of soldiers. American troops in the trenches spoke less and listened more. Officers stood for long periods at the maps, placing their fingers on a line and silently pulling them away. Messenger soldiers ran along the muddy roads, whispering information instantly carried to headquarters. At night, the sky seemed darker. Even the stars seemed hidden. When the muffled sound of a cannon in the distance was heard, everyone flinched, then tried to act as if nothing had happened a few seconds later. But no, one could shake the same question from within. Were these preparations the final effort of a defense, or the beginning of a move that would change everything? This invisible activity beyond the barbed wire fences weighed heavily on the front lines. Every trace in the mud, every shadow appearing in the night, was perceived as a harbinger of the approaching storm, and the soldiers felt it deeply. Guard duty rosters were tightened, ammunition crates were moved to more accessible places, and stretchers were already being lined up along the corridors. No one spoke openly, but everyone sensed that what was about to explode wouldn't be just artillery shells, because this silence was no ordinary pause. This was the moment history held its breath. The moment silence changed shape. The silence on the front lines was no longer the same. That emptiness, which had initially been comforting and made the night bearable, now carried a completely different meaning. Everyone realized this silence was not for rest, but for preparation. American troops rose before dawn, the trenches were rearranged, and walls at risk of collapsing were reinforced with planks. Sandbags were carried, narrow passages were widened, and the areas in front of machine gun nests were carefully cleared. Scouts now stayed on duty longer, binoculars were raised more frequently, and the horizon line was observed for minutes at a time. Maps in the headquarters were constantly changing. One day, arrows drawn in red were erased. The next day, blue markers were shifted slightly to the right, and some areas were covered with a dark pen. No one explicitly stated the reason, but everyone felt that this was not an ordinary rearrangement. Conversations among the soldiers had shortened. The stories once told around the campfire at night were replaced by single-word sentences. No one wanted to speak unnecessarily, because every word felt like it would invite misfortune. And at that very moment, in some sections of the front line, the artillery fire began to take on an unusual pattern. There were no long bombardments, but there were short, sharp, measured shots. It was as if someone had begun to test the other side. The moment silence changed shape. The silence on the front lines was no longer the same. That emptiness, which had initially been comforting and made the night bearable, now carried a completely different meaning. Everyone realized this silence was not for rest, but for preparation. American troops rose before dawn, the trenches were rearranged, and walls at risk of collapsing were reinforced with planks. Sandbags were carried, narrow passages were widened, and the areas in front of machine gun nests were carefully cleared. Scouts now stayed on duty longer, binoculars were raised more frequently, and the horizon line was observed for minutes at a time. Maps in the headquarters were constantly changing. One day, arrows drawn in red were erased. The next day, blue markers were shifted slightly to the right, and some areas were covered with a dark pen. No one explicitly stated the reason, but everyone felt that this was not an ordinary rearrangement. Conversations among the soldiers had shortened. The stories once told around the campfire at night were replaced by single-word sentences. No one wanted to speak unnecessarily, because every word felt like it would invite misfortune. And at that very moment, in some sections of the front line, the artillery fire began to take on an unusual pattern. There were no long bombardments, but there were short, sharp, measured shots. It was as if someone had begun to test the other side. The calculation behind the maps. Inside a tent, the yellow light of lamps half illuminated the faces of officers bent over a table. Their uniforms were covered in mud, their boots unwashed for days. In the middle of the table lay a large front-line map. Its edges were curled, opened and closed repeatedly. Fingers traced the lines. Pressure can be applied from here. No, this is still too open. If we shift the artillery to this line, sentences were interrupted, replaced by new calculations, because everyone knew a wrong move could determine the fate of thousands of men. American troops were no longer just the learning side. They were sending observation reports, recording movements in the German lines, tracking the direction of trench digging, where the barbed wire was concentrated, where the machine gun nests were increasing, was being marked one by one. One report contained a striking detail. Some German units seemed to be slowly withdrawing from the front line, but this was not a retreat. This was a repositioning. And these kinds of actions were usually done before something bigger. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone was considering the same possibility. The change within the soldiers. For the soldiers waiting on the front lines, war was no longer just a matter of reports read from afar, arrows drawn in headquarters tents, or colored markings on maps. The earth was now beneath their feet, heavy, wet, sticky, gripping their boots with every step, the mud accumulating at the bottom of the trenches rising up to their knees. The smell of gunpowder didn't come with the wind. It permeated the air, never disappearing. The explosions piercing the sky were no longer just a sound, but a tremor felt in the chest. The newly arrived units were silent in their first days. They surveyed their surroundings, their faces looking around with a stern attention. The old units were also silent, but this was a different kind of silence. A silence that avoided unnecessary movement, lowered their voices even when speaking, measured their steps in the dark. Experienced soldiers now kept their jokes short, kept their eyes fixed on the horizon, frequently raised their binoculars, and involuntarily glanced at the barbed wire at the edges of the trenches. Even sleep had changed. They lay down with their boots on, rifles resting on their knees, gas masks by their bedside, and ammunition pouches loosened so they could be opened in a single motion if necessary. At night, the trenches transformed into a different world. Distant artillery fire, occasional flashes of light piercing the sky, the wind brushing against the barbed wire. Everything felt higher, closer than it actually was. The guards stared into the darkness without blinking, double-checking even the smallest shadow. It had become commonplace for several rifle barrels to turn simultaneously in the direction of even a mouse passing by. Letters were written, but most were unfinished. A soldier would pull a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, scribble a few lines, then stop and try to erase it, write again, and give up again. Some would simply write the word, "I'm fine," followed by a long blank space, because it was difficult to describe what they had experienced. The mud, the waiting, the chest-shaking sound of explosions. They felt that these things couldn't be contained in words. As night fell, whispers grew louder in the trenches. "The artillery has moved closer. I saw lights on the opposite line last night. They say new units have arrived." These words weren't spoken aloud. They circulated from ear to ear. No one knew if the rumors were true. But rumors spread faster than fear, and fear didn't come shouting. It seeped in silently. It manifested itself in the quickening of breaths, in the slightly harder pull on triggers, in those few seconds of hesitation that stretched before falling asleep at night. The soldiers didn't admit it to each other, but everyone knew something had changed inside them, and this change was not yet complete. Towards the breaking point, one morning, unusual activity began on the front line. Artillery units were changing positions. Silently, heavy batteries, under camouflage nets, were dragged to new positions in the late hours of the night. The slightest sound of wheels being muffled by mud, ammunition crates were piled up in rows, fuses were checked, and cables were relayed through the trenches. Lanterns were briefly switched on and off. Officers leaned over maps and whispered. Messenger soldiers ran from trench to trench. Orders were one sentence, clear, unquestionable, and leave no room for delay. The preparations were no longer concealed, but they were still not announced. American troops were moved forward in some sectors. New trenches were dug, old lines repaired, and barbed wire was pulled further forward in the darkness of the night. Reconnaissance patrols were intensified. Small groups crept into the fog. The slightest sound from the enemy lines was reported. Even the time and location of a lamp burning on the other side were noted. The hum of planes soaring in the sky was heard more frequently, and the lines were scanned with cameras. Every detail now carried meaning. Every trace summoned a possibility. And then, one night, an unusual silence fell along the front. There was no artillery fire, no machine gun clang, no the usual echo of explosions from afar. Only the wind, the rustling of rags fluttering on the barbed wire, the breathing in the trenches, the muffled sounds of boots sinking into the mud. Every detail that normally went unnoticed seemed much louder that night. The sentries kept their binoculars close, their eyes fixed on the darkness, mistaking anything that moved in the shadows for an enemy. Even lighting a cigarette was risky. A small light could attract fire from the opposite line. These were the nights the soldiers feared most, because everyone knew, after nights like these, something usually began. But when? And who would move first? Some had already started counting in their heads. The minutes, the hours, the color of the sky, the direction of the wind, whether the ground was trembling. It was as if even nature was whispering something approaching, but not naming it. Officers walked around the trenches, looked at the soldiers' faces, and passed by with a brief nod. No one said, "Get ready," because everyone already understood that they had to be ready. Because the issue was no longer about America getting used to war. The issue was whether the next move would, and that move seemed to be growing in the silence hanging over the front line. It wasn't far away, it just hadn't been fired yet. Longer hours in the trenches. Nights now felt longer. The calendar pages were turning, but time flowed differently on the front. The difference between the beginning and the end of a shift sometimes blurred, making it difficult for soldiers to tell if it was morning or evening. The sky often closed over them like a leaden shroud. Clouds drifted slowly, and rain and fog mingled. Mud slowly accumulated at the bottom of the trenches, filling their boots and making each step more tiring. Wet fabric absorbed the cold, fingers went numb, and the rifles carried on their shoulders felt heavier than they were. Guard changes had become silent. The clicking of metal buckles was wrapped in cloth, and the bolts of rifles weren't pulled back unnecessarily. Lighters were hidden in palms, and cigarettes were lit against the wind at the bottom of the trenches. Even whispers were kept short, because everyone knew there were ears on the other side. Sometimes even the slightest sound of a falling rock in the night would make hearts race. and everyone would instinctively duck to the edge of the trench. Some soldiers watched the sky from the edge of the trench. Clouds drifted slowly, stars occasionally appearing and disappearing. Some tried to remember the ceiling at home, a cracked wooden beam, the yellow light of the lamp, the moment they laid their heads on the pillow, the smell of warm soup, the crackling of the stove from the crack in the door. But each time, a distant cannon shot interrupted their thoughts. A muffled rumble from deep within the earth echoed in their chests, leaving a kind of vibration that emptied one's insides. A patrol returned. They were covered in mud. Their coats were heavy. They had blank expressions on their faces. They spoke little, but the expression in their eyes said enough. There was movement on the opposite line. The traces of newly dug trenches were visible, crates being carried, the sound of shovels working throughout the night. Shadows rising from time to time. How many? What kind? No one knew for sure, but no one was saying, maybe not today anymore, because if not today, it could be tomorrow. If not tomorrow, the next night. And this possibility lingered like a heavy fog in the trenches. Some were praying, some were calculating, some were just waiting silently. Some were checking the edge of their helmets with their fingers, some were checking their bayonets repeatedly, some were opening a small piece of paper in their pocket, reading a few words, and folding it again. Time was stretching, but at the same time narrowing. It was as if an invisible circle was slowly closing, and everyone in the trenches silently carried the same question. What kind of morning would this waiting bring? And when that morning came, would the sun really have risen? In the shadow of the artillerymen, when dawn broke, the fog had not yet dispersed. The horizon seemed suspended between grey and white. Dewdrops accumulated on the barbed wire, slowly trickling down to the ground. The artillery positions were covered with camouflage nets. The barrels barely visible, they stood motionless, like dull, patient creatures emerging from the earth. Ammunition crates were piled in neat rows. The markings on the crates were faded, their corners covered in mud. The shells lined up beside them gleamed with a dull glint in the morning light, waiting silently. Officers bent over maps, measuring with rulers, drawing lines between points. Fingers traced a line, then moved to another point, then returned again. The same lines were measured over and over, numbers whispered to confirm the accuracy of the angles. But these lines were not the kind that would remain on paper. Each one determined the direction of the fire that would soon rise into the sky. Telephone lines were checked, signal cables were reconnected. Soldiers worked kneeling as the cables were routed through the mud, repeatedly checking the connections even though their fingers were numb from the cold. When a break was found, everyone bent down simultaneously, and no one stood up until the problem was fixed. The messenger soldiers stuffed the notes into their pockets and started running. They trudged through the mud, disappearing into the twists and turns of the trenches. Orders were kept short. Attention, wait, do not leave your position. Soldiers in one battery were wiping the shells with oily rags, repeatedly checking the fuse mechanisms. The rags turned black. Their hands became oily, but no one cared. One soldier inserted the fuse, then removed it, put it back in, and checked it again. Another illuminated the inside of the barrel with a flashlight, searching for the slightest imperfection. No one wanted to make a mistake. A small error at such a moment could have consequences hundreds of meters away. The troops inside the trenches watched these preparations from afar. Before the cannon spoke, everyone could sense their presence. The slight tremor of the earth, the sound of metal scraping, the closing of the wooden crates' lids, the crumbs of commands carried by the wind. And the thought rising within, once it begins, It will be difficult to stop. The soldiers adjusted the brim of their helmets, tightened the straps on their chins, and pulled their rifles to their sides. Some knelt, heads bowed, others fixed their eyes on the opposite line, searching for the first light that would appear in the fog. Everyone felt two things at once, both the confidence of an approaching force and an uncertain fear of what that force might sweep away. The minutes grew longer. The hours stretched on. No one spoke loudly, as if a single wrong word would open the hatches in the sky. And that's precisely why everyone waited. Because if the artillery was ready, the next move would no longer be in the trenches, but would be made in the direction of history. And no one knew yet how big that move would be. Whispers and numbers. The air was heavy in the headquarters tents. The canvas walls couldn't completely block out the cold outside. Inside, the sooty light of the oil lamps magnified the shadows. Maps were spread out on the tables, reports piled in the corners. Pencil notes, hastily drawn arrows, crossed out possibilities. Some pages had folded edges, others were softened from being opened and closed repeatedly. In the hazy light, the lines blurred together, and it was only upon close inspection that it was clear whether a line or a retreat was indicated. An officer wrote a number on the edge of the paper, then he stopped. The sound of an eraser was heard. He crossed it out. He added another number. These numbers were troop numbers, ammunition stocks, time calculations. But in reality, they all led to the same question. Was it enough? Another man placed a ruler on the map, measured the distance between 2 points, and calculated with his lips moving. The officer next to him leaned over, looked over his shoulder, and nodded slightly. These small gestures had replaced lengthy discussions. No one wanted to use unnecessary words, because every sentence could create new uncertainty. Reconnaissance reports were arriving. Mud-covered boots stood in front of the tent. Soldiers entering took off their helmets, saluted, and then handed over a crumpled piece of paper from their pockets. New trenches were reportedly being dug on the opposite front. Railway activity had increased. Wagons went back and forth at night, hiding behind wooded areas during the day. Artillery batteries were concealed. The barrels were covered with nets, the tire tracks erased by branches. All this reinforced a single possibility. Something was being prepared. That was the darkness. In a corner of the tent, an officer tried to light a cigarette, then gave up. He thought the match flame might be noticeable from outside. Instead, he clasped his fingers together and leaned against the table. Another looked at the clock. The hour hand was ticking, but it seemed never to reach the expected point. Outside the tent, soldiers were smoking, hiding the flames of their matches in their palms. The smoke lingered briefly in the air, then blended into the fog. Some were talking, but avoiding the main topic. Letters from home, dreams of hot meals, things to do when returning to civilian life. One spoke of the river in his town, another described the bread his mother made. Laughter was short-lived, followed by silence again. No one said the word attack aloud, because the moment you said it, it felt like it would become real. And perhaps that was the most frightening thing. Everyone felt it was already approaching. Numbers lay on the tables, maps folded and waiting. But the answers hadn't been written yet. And when those answers emerged, it might be too late to turn back. Pressure on the line. In the late afternoon, the wind changed direction. This small detail caught the officer's attention, because the wind determined where the smoke would go. The gas, the fog that would rise after the artillery fire, and how visibility would be disrupted when darkness fell. Eyes turned to the sky. The clouds were heavy. They seemed to have descended, preparing to descend upon the trenches. There was dampness. The uniforms clung to the ground, and a faint coolness was felt on the metal parts of the weapons. The ground was soft. Every step left a mark, and mud clung to the soles of the boots. All of this was calculated individually. Next to the arrows on the maps, not only distances but also weather conditions were now noted. An attack was won not only by the number of soldiers, but also by the direction of the wind, the density of the fog, and how dark the night would be. In the trenches, the soldiers cleaned their rifles, checked their bayonets, and refolded the small notepads in their pockets. The barrels were being wiped with rags, the mechanisms silently pulled and released. No one wanted to hear the metallic sound. Some had written names on the inside of their helmets. The faint pencil marks were already beginning to fade with sweat. Some took out a photograph from their pocket and looked at it for a moment, then put it away again. They avoided looking at faces because they didn't want to see their own fears in someone else's eyes. In a corner of a trench, two soldiers sat side by side. One was tightening his bootlaces again, while the other looked at the horizon. They didn't speak. Speaking felt like breaking this silence. But this silence wasn't an ordinary weight. There was a weight within it. It was as if even the earth had held its breath. No whistle sound was heard. Not yet. But everyone felt that the sound was not a matter of days, but of moments. Somewhere, a finger must be touching a line on a map. Somewhere, an order must be written on paper but not yet sent. And at this point, the tension on the front lines was no longer hidden. The air was heavy. The ground was silent. But this silence carried something substantial, like a future ready to explode. The soldiers didn't put it into words, but their shoulders were a little more tense. Their fingers lingered longer around the trigger guards. Their eyes looked a little more carefully into the darkness, because everyone felt the same thing. Something was approaching, and when it came, no one wanted to be caught unprepared. From silence to the table, the sound of cannon suddenly ceased one morning. The batteries that had shaken the ground for months fell silent. The smoke rising from the trenches slowly dispersed. The soldiers couldn't believe it at first. No one wanted to look up, because silence on the front sometimes signaled a new attack. But hours passed, and nothing happened. No fire came from the opposing lines. Scouts reported. White cloths were waving. Bugle calls were heard. The chain of command reached headquarters. Ceasefire. American troops cautiously emerged from the trenches. Mud-covered boots, worn uniforms, sleepless faces. Everyone looked at each other. There was joy, but it was a strange joy. Silent, heavy, as if it would be broken if too much noise were made. Some sat down on the ground. Some lowered their rifles from their shoulders for the first time. Some pulled out letters from their pockets that had been written months ago but never sent. Folded papers were unfolded, then folded again. Some soldiers knew the lines by heart now, but they still couldn't help but look. Eyes turned to the horizon. Barbed wire was still there. Fallen trees, fields full of pits, shattered trenches. The traces of war were not disappearing. Silence didn't erase them. On the contrary, it made them even more visible. One soldier slowly took off his helmet. Another leaned his rifle against the ground. A third took a deep breath, and that breath felt like it had been held for months. The war was over, but bodies were still in the war. Ears flinched at the slightest sound. Eyes reflexively searched for trenches. Feet treaded cautiously even on flat ground. No one could fully relax, because on the front lines, one learns to relax last. Some looked for their comrades. The people walking beside them were counted again. There were missing, and everyone silently noticed it. The officers advanced slowly. Orders were no longer shouted but whispered. The maps were still unfolded, but the arrows had been erased. They had been replaced by blanks. Blanks meant questions. What would happen now? How long would it last? Was it really over? No one asked aloud, because there was something learned on the battlefield. Some sentences become reality when spoken. The war was over, but the scars of the war were in everyone's heart. And those scars would return home with the soldiers. They would seep into the future of countries. They would mingle with the maps spread on the tables. The sound of cannons had ceased, but history was not yet ready to be silent. Winners, losers, and signatures. The battlefield shifted to the diplomatic table. Carpets replaced the earth. Polished parquet floors replaced the mud. The roar of the trenches turned into the muffled whispers of the halls. But one thing remained unchanged. Everyone knew that now it would be pens, not guns, that would speak. Long tables, thick curtains, files opened under flickering lights. The signed papers were drawing not only borders but also the future. America was no longer a country withdrawing from the stage. It was at the very heart of world affairs. Presidential speeches were full of hope. Newspapers spoke of a new era. Such a disaster will never happen again, they said. International collaborations, new institutions, dreams of shared security were flying around. But some faces at the table were uneasy. Some delegates fell silent. Some gritted their teeth. Some read the terms repeatedly, as if trying to decipher the meanings buried between the lines. Because peace treaties often didn't just end wars, they also sowed the seeds of future wars. For the defeated side, it was more like a postponed reckoning than a compromise. The numbers that flowed from the pens were so large they shook economies. Reparations were written, armies were downsized, ports, mines and railroads were debated. New lines drawn on maps sometimes changed the lives of millions with a single stroke of a ruler. Lands were divided, states were renamed, borders were born at the negotiating table. But people couldn't fit within the borders. American delegates took notes, objected to the drafts, and tried to change the tone of the sentences. Sometimes there were offers of softening the text. Sometimes there were harsh warnings. Because there were debates in Washington too. To what extent would they be involved in this new world order? To what extent should the problems in Europe be an American issue? America was returning from the front. But was the world returning to peace? Or was it merely breathing? The newspaper headlines were exuberant. Celebrations took place in public squares. Soldiers returned home, but production in factories was once again turned to weapons. Debts piled up. Unemployment spread. The silence that followed the war was filled with economic fluctuations. In some countries, disillusionment hardened. In others, pride was wounded. In some, new ideas began to sprout. Radical rhetoric, promises of revenge, oaths to reclaim lost honor. The signatures on the table had dried, but the spirits were still wet. And history always prepared its most dangerous moments when people said, "It's over," because peace treaties sometimes closed one era but left the door ajar for another. And the shadow that slipped through that open door could be the harbinger of a storm that no one had yet loudly named. Did America sense this? Was the world aware? Or had everyone simply chosen to believe, for a while, that things were normal again? The answers weren't on paper yet, but time was preparing to write them. Cracks forming within peace. The 1920s began. Jazz music, fast-paced cities, gliding shop windows, new cars, buildings reaching for the sky. In America, people wanted to believe the war was over. The streets were full. Music blasted in nightclubs, Dance floors never empty until dawn. Factories increased production. Electric lights illuminated neighborhoods. Newspapers spoke of a new age, enthusiastically describing the possibilities offered by modern life. The future looked bright, but in some cities in Europe, the silence was different. The wind blew through the ruined neighborhoods. Cold air entered through empty windows. The scars of war had not been erased from the sidewalks. Soldiers with prosthetic legs begged at train stations. Those who could not return home sought shelter. Borders had been redrawn after the fall of empires, but the borders in people's minds were far more complex. In some countries, the discourse began to harden. Newspapers were searching for culprits. Politicians were raising their voices from podiums. Crowds were gathering in squares. Who brought us to this state? Where is justice? How will the lost pride be regained? New leaders were rising. Sharp voices, simple answers. One-sentence solutions were offered to complex problems. Certain groups were being pointed to as responsible for unemployment, inflation, and social collapse, and anger was slowly finding its direction. Some who had returned from the battlefields were now on the podiums, and America was watching these changes from across the ocean, at first from afar, then more carefully. Diplomatic reports were reaching Washington, embassies were noting the new developments, debates were taking place in the halls of Congress, questioning how much involvement should be given to foreign policy. On one hand, there was a desire to turn inward. On the other, a growing concern that the world was once again in turmoil. Because the world was stirring again. The rise of stock markets stood side by side with unrest in Europe. The squares, darkened by the lights of the dance halls, were in the same era. While prosperity was discussed in one place, whispers of revenge circulated in another. And as often happens in history, the most dangerous changes don't come loudly at first. They begin in small columns in newspapers. They appear in footnotes to speeches. They are heard in a few shouts in the crowds. Then they slowly make their way to the center stage. America might not yet see this as a storm, but clouds were gathering in the sky. And this time, the return of war might not come as a surprise. Only the question was becoming increasingly weighty. Where would the next explosion begin? And could America really stay aloof this time? The shadows lengthen. By the 1930s, the tone had changed. Newspaper headlines darkened. Economic crises erupted. Stock markets crashed. Factories closed. Unemployment spread. Queues formed in front of banks. People saw the money in their pockets become worthless overnight. Families lost their homes. Soup kitchens overflowed. Hope was no longer found in shop windows, but in aid lists. Radical ideas gained strength. Because uncertainty always calls for harsh solutions, military parades returned in some countries. The sound of boots passing through the square recalled a rhythm that seemed to have been silenced years ago. Uniforms were being sewn again. Parades were being held, and flags raised to the sky carried new interpretations of old symbols. Flags changed, slogans rose, armies began to grow again. New weapons projects were secretly financed. Ships were being launched in shipyards, and production lines in aircraft factories worked day and night. Maps were laid out again on the tables. Generals gazed intently at the border lines. America was cautious at this time. The public did not want war. The cost of the First World War was still remembered. Veterans spoke in public squares. Newspapers ran headlines saying, "Let's not send our sons to a new European fight." Those who said, "Let's mind our own business," were in the majority. but maps were being reprinted in the newspapers. Arrows, arrows, arrows again. These small graphics on the outer pages were actually a harbinger of a larger story. Intercontinental trade routes, military build-up areas, disputed borders. Each arrow pointed to a potential conflict, and military reports began to use words reminiscent of the First World War: mobilization, alliances, armament, naval movement, air force expansion. The tone of diplomatic correspondence hardened, and protest notes became increasingly shorter. And then a country pushed its borders. The shadows lengthened. By the 1930s, the tone had changed. Newspaper headlines darkened. Economic crises erupted. Stock markets crashed. Factories closed. Unemployment spread. Queues formed in front of banks. People saw the money in their pockets become worthless overnight. Families lost their homes. Soup kitchens overflowed. Hope was no longer found in shop windows, but in aid lists. Radical ideas gained strength. Because uncertainty always calls for harsh solutions, military parades returned in some countries. The sound of boots passing through the square recalled a rhythm that seemed to have been silenced years ago. Uniforms were being sewn again. Parades were being held, and flags raised to the sky carried new interpretations of old symbols. Flags changed, slogans rose, armies began to grow again. New weapons projects were secretly financed. Ships were being launched in shipyards, and production lines in aircraft factories worked day and night. Maps were laid out again on the tables. Generals gazed intently at the border lines. America was cautious at this time. The public did not want war. The cost of the First World War was still remembered. Veterans spoke in public squares. Newspapers ran headlines saying, "Let's not send our sons to a new European fight." Those who said, "Let's mind our own business," were in the majority, but maps were being reprinted in the newspapers. Arrows, arrows, arrows again. These small graphics on the outer pages were actually a harbinger of a larger story. Intercontinental trade routes, military build-up areas, disputed borders. Each arrow pointed to a potential conflict, and military reports began to use words reminiscent of the First World War: mobilization, alliances, armament, naval movement, air force expansion. The tone of diplomatic correspondence hardened, and protest notes became increasingly shorter. And then a country pushed its borders. At first, it was presented as a small move, a correction, a historical claim, but borders didn't change like that. Borders were usually the beginning of something bigger. No one loudly declared a new world war, but everyone thought the same thing. Journalists chose their words, diplomats softened their sentences, politicians tried to appear hopeful. But at night, behind closed doors, other questions were being discussed. Where is this going? Who will say stop? And if no one stops, what will be the next step? It was believed that the oceans would provide protection, but history likes to show that the oceans aren't always enough. And the shadow growed a little longer each month. The arrows on the maps multiplied, the reports thickened, the warning notes piled up on the tables. A storm was approaching. It hadn't erupted yet, but the atmosphere had changed. And the same question was growing in everyone's minds. This time, was it really avoidable? Towards the second storm, America wasn't yet in the fire, but the fire had begun to burn again. First in the distance, then on the edges of maps, then in newspaper columns, and increasingly at the center of diplomatic reports. The world was unknowingly being divided in two again. Alliances were forming, Old friendships were being questioned, and lines of neutrality were being drawn with thick pens. Warships were seen more frequently in ports, and military production plans were being discussed in factories. A war had ended, but its traces had not been erased. Ruined cities, lost empires, broken economies, and angrily written agreements were preparing the ground for a new conflict. Peace was on paper, but it was still full of cracks in people's minds. And right here, this video leaves us at a critical juncture, the silent years following a world war, then slowly rising threats, and a question that can no longer be hidden. Was the next clash inevitable? In the next chapter, we are entering a time when America will no longer be merely an observer. As the sense of security across the oceans crumbles, the tone in Washington's meeting rooms begins to shift. Maps are laid out on the tables again. Generals are making calculations. Diplomats are weighing their words. Presidential advisors are choosing their words, circling around the question, can we really stay out of it this time? Or will history drag America once again into the heart of the fire? The answer is yet to come, but the shadows continue to lengthen. And this story doesn't end here, because in the next chapter, not just whispers, decisions will speak, preparations will accelerate, and the world will embark on a path from which there is no return. From storm to storm. In this video, we saw how a war fell silent. That strange silence that replaced the sound of cannons in the trenches, the moments when soldiers emerged from the mud and looked at the sky with doubt, the fragile peace treaty signed by diplomats behind thick curtains, and then the years when cities were reborn but unrest slowly grew in other corners of the world. From the hopeful streets of the 1920s to the darkening headlines of the 1930s. From collapsing stock markets to rising slogans, from redrawn maps to armed armies. We watched those cautious years when America tried to stay beyond the ocean. In this episode, America was not yet in the fire, but the fire had begun to burn again. Peace was on paper, but there were still questions in people's minds. There were resentments and a growing unease about the future. A world war had ended, but its legacy had already sown the seeds of another war. We stand here today, before the first bombs fall, before the sirens sound, before the decisions are openly announced, but on that fine line where the world changes direction. In the next episode, we will talk about an America that is no longer content to merely watch. The nights in Washington, the discussions behind closed doors, and finally, those days that irrevocably changed the course of history, the steps taken into the Second World War. For now, we stop here. But this story is not over yet, because some wars don't begin on the battlefield, they begin at the table, on the pages of newspapers, and in people's minds. Thank you for watching. Before you close your eyes, consider this. Why does the second world approach so quickly when the first one has just fallen silent? Good night. See you in the next episode.